Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Unashamed podcast. Today is our third episode in our series on relationships. This whole month, as we've said numerous times now, you better understand it now, is all going to be based on relationships. Today, we are going to be tackling a very important topic, which is your relationship with yourself. I think that often gets blown over by most people when they're talking about relationships. You assume that means relationships with other people and with God. But today we want to talk about your relationship with yourself and the whole concept of self-love. And I think the kind of why people usually don't touch on this is because it's kind of a hard topic to talk about, especially because you really have two extremes. You kind of have people on this side of the spectrum who hate themselves and they're depressed and they're suicidal and all of that stuff, which is obviously really unhealthy. Yeah. But then you also have a side over here that is people who are full of themselves and think they're the best thing that has ever happened to earth and all that stuff, which is pride. And that's also super unhealthy. And so really we're trying to figure out what's the biblical kind of version of self-love. And really, I guess, what does the world also have to say about self-love? And is that right? Is that wrong? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the world has kind of painted self-love, especially over the last couple of years with social media and, you know, these different movements that we have. They've painted self-love as a self-centered thing, as in, I deserve this, you know. Self-love has almost become a thing where we override all other relationships in order to love ourselves. And I think when we look at that commandment where God tells us to love others and to love God with all our heart and our soul and our strength, the part where it says loving your neighbors as yourself, I feel like that's a part that we often misunderstand, because it's not really telling us to love ourselves, but it's telling us to love others as ourselves. And that's a natural thing that we do. Even when you struggle with insecurity, or you struggle with doubt, or whatever it may be, like at the core of every man, we want the best for ourselves. And so that's why we get up in the morning. That's why we eat. You know, that's why we get dressed. We naturally take care of ourselves. We don't really need to be told to love ourselves. Of course, like you mentioned, there are unhealthy aspects to our relationship with ourselves where we neglect ourselves or our needs and stuff like that. But when it comes to loving ourselves, I think that those two extremes can only be resolved by looking at what God has said about man. And there are two sides to those as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think the world has definitely painted it as, especially in like philosophy and stuff like that. Now I'm studying psychology, so I have to study that kind of stuff. But a lot of the theories are kind of like, humans are fundamentally good, and humans are at their core, we're good people. And that's just not true. Even if you threw Christianity out the window, I mean, if all people were fundamentally good, you know, why do we have wars? Why are we always fighting?
Crimes.
Why is there so much division in our world? People can't get along. And I think that's because the Bible is right when it says that we in our nature are sinful people, and we're not good people. And I think that where we kind of have to start when we talk about self-love, in a biblical sense, because of course we're going to kind of knock on the world's idea of self-love, which is too high. But we also want to make sure that everyone understands that we have eternal value and infinite value as human beings. And I think where that comes from is in Genesis 1. When you go verse 26, when God is creating everything, it says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them." You know, mankind was made in the image of God. And if you look over the creation account, man is the only thing or being
Creature, yeah.
that gets that stamp of God's image. And I mean, that's insane. Like that gives us as human beings intrinsic worth.
Yeah.
And what I mean by intrinsic worth is we are valuable in ourselves. It doesn't matter who you are, what you do. It doesn't matter. You have value, and you are valued by God and loved infinitely by him because you have that stamp of his image on yourself. And what we'll talk about in other podcasts and stuff is that all throughout the Bible, you know, God's main priority is really his glory. And so how awesome is it that he then creates man and stamps his glory on man as a reflection of who he is.
Right.
And so we, according to the Bible, all humans have an intrinsic value, an infinite, eternal value of bearing God's image. And just a side note, that's why Christians find abortion so disgusting, is because that's a human that has the image of God in it, and it has value, and so many people just throw that away because it's inconvenient or whatever. And that's a whole nother topic where we're not putting it, we're not saying it's as simple as that. But we all have the image of God stamped on us. And I think the other thing you have to understand, that's one thing that you have to understand when it comes to self-love. But the other thing you have to understand is that image of God has now been tainted and kind of messed up by sin. And we all sin, right? We all do things contrary to what God purposed for us. And if you haven't ever read Genesis 3 where man falls, go read that, because it gives you an idea of what kind of happens. But sin messes with our ability to reflect God's glory. And I think where the other side of self-love comes in when you're talking biblically is, yes, we all have intrinsic value, but we can't take that and learn to accept our sins. Because that's the problem with just saying, oh, well, I love myself, I'm happy, I'm satisfied with who I am. You really shouldn't be satisfied with who you are. If you look inside yourself, you shouldn't be satisfied with what you see. You should want to become better. And I don't think I've ever really talked to many people that are like, yeah, I don't want to be a better person than I am. I'm fine. I think we all understand that we all have things that we need to work on in our lives. And so this whole idea of self-love, while we have this value of the image of God, we have to recognize that it's been kind of tainted by sin. And sin kind of tries to hide that and tries to muck up the mirror that we were meant to be to reflect God's glory.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's so good, because with the idea of looking inward or to yourself, I mean, we hear often the idea of, you know, with the self-love movement, that you can't really love others if you don't love yourself first and things like that. So it's like, until you have gotten to that point, you can't show other people love. And I just don't think that's true, because when you look within yourself, that's actually really discouraging, because all you'll find in yourself is that brokenness. One of our pastors always says that you can put a man in a room by himself and he will still have conflict.
Yeah,
he will still
we still fight with ourselves.
Exactly. There's always this battle and this war within ourselves, because we are broken. And so looking within ourselves for love, and looking within ourselves for value, and firstly accepting ourselves, that doesn't really lead us to having a healthy relationship with ourselves, or having a healthy relationship with others or with God. And that's why it's so important to have a relationship with God, because it's through him that we begin to understand that intrinsic value that he's given us, and that we are people who are redeemed. I think that's where that true relationship with yourself stems from, is being able to understand yourself when you measure yourself with God, or when you compare to what God says. And the truth is that without Christ, and without all of the things that we talk about, without what he's done for humanity, like, the sad truth is that we are no good. We have no good.
Yeah.
And that's not to bash anyone, because like Zach said, we're made in the image of God, but without him, without actually having that relationship with him, we have no good apart from him. And so it has to start with our relationship with God. And that's where Jesus comes in and his role of redemption. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think where we get caught in the world's view of self-love is we take the concept of self-love and accepting yourself, and we start morphing it to say, oh, so we can accept our sin.
Right.
And our sin's okay now because it's part of us and it's part of who we are and all of that stuff. And I just, to be honest, I think that's not an act of self-love. I think that's an act of self-hatred. And I think that's
good.
I mean, if you take who you're meant to be, which is a sinless reflection of God's glory, and then you look at how you are, which is still riddled with sin and still murky, and it's sometimes hard to see God's glory in your life. Like, do you really want to settle for that? Like, because if you say, I'm going to accept myself, and part of that is I'm going to accept my sins and I'm going to be okay with that because it's just part of who I am, you're settling for less than what God meant you to be. And like Melissa said, that's kind of where Jesus comes in, is he helps us. He washes us with his blood, in that glory of God that we're meant to reflect kind of starts to shine through, and he works on us and makes us into the people that God meant us to be. And it's not an easy process. Of course, it's hard. It's hard to change who you are. And the sin that's in your life, it's hard to take that out of your life. But that's where Jesus comes in, is he frees us from this slavery to sin and frees us up to then strive towards a better future for ourselves and a better person of who we want to be.
Yeah.
And I think that when we get caught up in that self-love lie, we settle for less, then you're missing out on what Jesus can do in your life, and in the glory that is God, and the glory that is a relationship with Jesus. And we just don't want to miss out on that. Like, if you really love yourself, you don't want to miss out on that, because that's the greatest thing we could ever do in our lives.
Yeah, and that's so good. I think one of the other things is that when we think of self-love, or improvement, or like the things that Zach was saying about working on ourselves or becoming better, we're not becoming better versions of ourselves. We're not becoming better sinners, you know what I mean? But the aim and the goal is really to become more like Jesus, because he is the one who has ultimate value, who is not marred by sin as we are. And like he said, that God has modeled us after his image. And so the cool thing is, though sin has tainted us, because we're not completely glorifying God within our sinful nature, the cool thing is that Jesus, through his blood and through his sacrifice, is almost taking us back he's almost redeeming that image of God through himself, as we live for him, and as we honestly die to ourselves, because we're not really told to love ourselves in the way that the world does in the Bible. In fact, Paul tells us to not think too highly of ourselves, because that's where pride slips in. But in humility, model ourselves and model our lives after Christ.
Yeah, so good. So really, a summary of everything that we said is, for one, you have to accept that you have value. You have to see your value in the way God created you. God created you. You were beautifully and wonderfully made. That's what Psalm says. But the catch to that is, because of that, it's not even a catch. Because of that truth, you shouldn't settle for a sinful version of yourself. So you should be constantly striving to get rid of the sin, to get rid of those things that make your reflection of God's glory dirty. And so really, self-love, I think biblically, is striving to be like Jesus, because 100%. That's the highest self we could attain to. And we sound all philosophical or whatever, but really we're the Christian life is a constant striving to be like Jesus. And that's truly how you love yourself, because that's the happiest and the most joyful you could ever be, is when you become satisfied with God, satisfied with Jesus and who he is and who he wants to make you.
Yeah, that happiness that we're all after really comes from holiness.
Yep. So Yeah, that's our best attempt at tackling the topic of self-love. Again, if you have any questions or thoughts or whatever, if you disagree with us, feel free to message us. We'd love to have conversations with you guys as always. And yeah, side note, relationship study.
Right.
We are doing a relationship study. I'm going to tell you till all of you get on. We're doing a relationship study, a daily relationship study on a WhatsApp group. I am taking truths from a book, not the Bible. Well, yes, the Bible, but from a book that is based on the Bible, about how we can improve our relationships by looking at Jesus' example of how he went about relationships when he was on the earth. If you want in that group, message our Unashamed account, message one of our personal accounts, get a hold of us some way. We will get you on that group because it's going to be really good. When we are filming this, we are on day 3.
Yeah, we've done day 3.
We've done 3 days so far. It's been really good. We want you guys on there. So if you haven't gotten on there yet, get on there now, and we will see you in the next episode. Peace.